So a bit of an introduction to Guild Insurance for those who may not know too much about us. So Guild's been in existence now for 61 years. We celebrated our 60th birthday last year. Just very quickly, the background in that, 61 years ago, a pharmacist in South Australia was talking to a hairdresser. She was under a lot of stress at the time. Someone had slipped and fallen in her salon, injured themselves and was threatening to sue. And she realised she didn't have any insurance to protect herself. This pharmacist thought the same thing, that could happen to them in pharmacy. So through an organisation that's now the Pharmacy Guild of Australia, it had a different name back then, the Pharmacy Guild of Australia set up insurance for pharmacists, which was Guild Insurance. So here we are now. So very much our background is in health. We insure a huge number of different sorts of health professionals out there. We insure a couple of professions that aren't really in the health space. Veterinarians, who I guess are health, but just animal health, so a bit different. We insure childcare workers, also personal trainers, who I guess some of them do argue they're a bit in health, but a little bit different, not health professionals. But in the health space, on top of yourselves, as I mentioned, pharmacists, dentists, chiros, osteos, speech pathologists, dietitians, really quite broad who we insure, but very much the core of what we do is in health. The way we operate is we partner with associations. So as you would know, we are the recommended insurer from your association here. What that means in terms of the service we provide for you is that your association makes sure that the insurance we're offering you is suitable to you, and they make sure we understand what it is you do. So it's a great partnership in terms of sharing what we know about claims, what they know about your professions, to make sure then we're providing you with the most appropriate service. So just a quick background to who we are and what we do. So today's session, I've called it the top 10 risks or top 10 risk messages. So what I'm going to be doing is focusing on 10 key messages that I want you to really take away, a couple of, I guess, simple sort of do's and don'ts to practice in a way that will be safer, that will be more effective and more efficient, and to reduce the likelihood of complaints. As I go through each one, I'm happy for questions as we go. We can do questions at the end. We'll be here for the rest of the day or the rest of it this morning. So you can also ask questions then. I will have on the final slide my email address. So if you think of questions after today, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me. But as we move on to each of the 10 different topics, I'm more than happy for questions as we go. So feel free to interrupt. I like to joke that, as you mentioned, I was a school teacher, so more than used to being interrupted. So please feel free to jump in. This will be more interesting if you share your stories, thoughts, ideas, rather than just hearing me talk for the next sort of 45 minutes. So my first message to you, communicate effectively with other people that you're working with, so your patients, but other key people as well. Anytime I'm talking to health professionals, my first message is always effective communication. The reason I focus on that is when we delve deep into the complaints that come to us at Guild, we will sometimes see a complaint directly linked to communication. So someone will talk about poor communication. They'll mention that they were spoken to rudely, for example. But what we also find is a lot of claims where there's no mention of communication, but when we really sort of unpack what's happened, there was communication breakdown. So I have a bit of a theory that if we can improve communication, we can reduce claims that come to us at Guild Insurance. Yes, you need to focus on your clinical skills, your technical skills and knowledge. However, if you just focus on the clinical skills and if you're the best at what you do clinically, but your communication skills are pretty poor, I guarantee you're going to have some issues. So yes, focus on the clinical stuff, but please don't ever underestimate the importance of communication because it is so important. And I'll talk about this a little bit more sort of as we go throughout today's session. But what we're also seeing at Guild Insurance at the moment is a bit of a shift in, I'll use the term consumer because I think it's not just within health, we're seeing a bit of a shift in consumer demands and expectations. So whether that's patients in healthcare, whether that's people being served at reception in this hotel, whether it's people going to maybe their supermarket, people are becoming more willing to complain and they have higher expectations generally as consumers. And I think a big part of that is about communication. People expect effective communication, they expect to be spoken to in a particular way, and they're quite willing to complain if they're not dealt with in that way. So do just keep in mind it's not just the clinical outcome that impacts claims, it is also communication. Next area I want to talk to you about, patient expectations. Patient expectations is a really core part of that communication process. You need to manage your patient's expectations, before they're treated. So can we just change the view I've got here? I can't really see the slides. I'm just wondering if that can be switched over. It's really small for me. Thank you. Perfect, thanks so much. Can it be switched to the other one? Sorry, the actual slide, not the next one. Sorry for a moment. So I don't have to keep turning away from you. Okay, case I want to bring up in terms of patient expectations. So after a patient's first session of cupping therapy, they complained about the marks they had on their back. They complained they were unsightly, they thought they'd been injured, and that they had significant bruises. Now, this might be something that's expected from cupping, but if someone's never had cupping before, how do they know? So it's a really simple case of the patient just not being given information that will help them understand realistically what's going to happen from this treatment. What's going to happen in terms of how soon will they feel better, how are they going to feel after treatment, but also something like the marks and the bruising and potential blisters from cupping. If they don't understand that's to be expected, they're going to think something's gone wrong. So a couple of tips with patient expectations, a few things to keep in mind. If your patients have unrealistic expectations, simply by definition, you can't meet an unrealistic expectation. So you won't meet their expectations. When patients have unmet expectations, they're the patients most likely to complain. So it's really important that before you treat, you have a conversation with them about what it is they're expecting and what you know to actually be realistic for their clinical situation and the sort of treatment you're going to be providing. Keeping in mind, patients don't have your level of knowledge and expertise. And I think one of the challenges we all have, we do this in insurance as well, we forget that what we know is pretty common knowledge. What we know is you've been talking this particular area for so long, you've been working this particular area, language you've been using every day for the last 10, 20 years. You forget that language isn't common to everyone. So what's really obvious to you, and sometimes you probably think, surely that's a little bit obvious to the patient, quite often won't be. Just be really mindful about their level of understanding, what they'll understand. Also be really careful of the language you use when having those conversations, not using technical clinical terms that they won't understand. So make sure you understand your responsibility in this communication process to help your patients understand realistically what could happen, what could go wrong, how are they likely to feel after treatment, how soon are they likely to be feeling better, how soon should they get the outcome they're hoping for and expecting. Very important you have this conversation before treatment. When you explain afterwards why someone's got those marks from cupping, that might help put their concerns at ease, I guess, but they may not feel really too happy with that information then because they'll be thinking, but I should have known before I was treated. Make sure you have that conversation before so you're not then trying to settle an unhappy situation. Having the conversation first prevents that situation from coming up in the first place. Next area I want to talk to you about, treatment planning. So ensure your assessments are thorough and treatment plans are appropriate. Now, when I put this line up there, I always feel like it's a little bit insulting to health professionals to say, make sure your assessments are appropriate and the treatment plan's appropriate, because that's kind of at the core of what you do. I get that. However, looking at the claims we see at Guild Insurance, we know that sometimes the treatment planning doesn't go as it should, and we know that sometimes the treatment provided isn't the most appropriate. I'm not here and I'm not in a position to talk to you about what is appropriate treatment in different clinical situations. I'm not a health professional. What I want to encourage you to think about though is, why do we sometimes not get treatment planning and clinical decision making right? What are the sorts of things that can impact our treatment planning, our decision making? So sometimes it doesn't quite go to plan and sometimes errors are made. This is just a few ideas. There could be lots of other reasons. Your skill or experience level. If you're new to the industry, you can't know everything to begin with. And sometimes it just does take time to, I suppose, be comfortable in different situations, to deal with different situations facing you, to deal with sometimes those challenging patients. And sometimes you will work out, probably didn't do things the best way that particular time, we'll do things differently another time. Depending on what your work life is like and also your home life, you might be busy, under pressure, feeling a little bit stressed. All of those impacts on you, I guess, how that impacts you as a human. It's good to say we leave the stress at home and we don't bring it to work, or we won't let things impact how we work as a professional, but you're human. And we do make mistakes when we're under pressure, when things are on top of us. So think how you set up things at home, but also in the workplace. If you are working under pressure, feeling stressed, potentially a little bit more likely to make some mistakes. You've probably all had some challenging patients that might impact how you feel in those consultations and your sessions with them. You might be feeling a little bit under pressure, feeling a bit uncomfortable, have a bit of an anxious feeling when these patients come in. That can change how we do things and how we handle situations and that decision making. Falling into routines and habits. One of the questions I get asked a lot in my job at Guild Insurance is where on that sort of age spectrum do we see most of the complaints? There's often an assumption that it's people who are very new to their profession. So I guess it's not so much just age, but also years of experience. There's often an assumption that it's people who are new to a profession that are more likely to make mistakes and more likely to face complaints. It's actually not the case. We do see people very new to professions facing complaints. We've seen multiple cases of practitioners saying to us, I've been doing this job for 20, 30 years. I've never had a complaint. I've never had this go wrong. I can't believe this has happened to me now. And we see them at all those sort of timeframes in between that as well. What I think can happen is those who've been doing their job for a really long time, you become very familiar with what you're doing, you've done things so many times, and it can be easy to sometimes slip into some routines and some habits. What can also happen, I guess, at the other end of that professional scale is when you're very new to a profession, sometimes those people are a bit more mindful of potentially making a mistake. They've also just studied and just learned what is current best practice. So in ways, sometimes they can be a little bit safer. As I said, errors can happen at any stage of your career, but what I encourage you to really think about is as you go throughout your career and as you do this for a longer time, just keep checking yourself that you're not falling into some routines and habits, you're not doing things in the same way each time, but you're stopping and really reflecting, am I making the best choice for this particular patient with their particular individual circumstances? Do I need to do something different? Have you really had what I like to call that stop and think moment? How should I actually be treating this patient, their condition? You don't just treat a condition, you treat a patient with that condition. Are you stopping and reflecting each time? Moving on to tip number 4. Know when to refer patients and don't treat those you shouldn't. I think this is a little bit of a challenging area for a lot of health professionals for a few reasons. You want to do what's best for your patients. You want to provide them with treatment, you want to ease whatever sort of pain, suffering, symptoms, whatever it is they're feeling. However, sometimes your treatment won't be the best treatment for them. So you really need to think about, are you the best person to be providing treatment? And if you're not, what are you going to do about that? So a couple of things to think about. Always make sure you're making the most appropriate clinical decision for that particular patient. So sometimes that means you as a health professional need to decide, actually what this patient needs is not what I can actually give them. My second point there, I've said, don't allow yourself to be coerced into providing just a light massage. Now that depends on what sort of treatment and therapy you provide, but I'm using it as an example because what we often hear patients say to health professionals is, oh look, I will go see someone else, but while I'm here, could you just do something for me? So whatever it is you do, they might want just a little bit of therapy, just a quick massage or something of the like. So, because I've already come just for something. They don't want to go away sometimes with nothing. But you need to decide that whatever it is you do provide, if that's not clinically justified and if that's not in their best interests, that is on you as a health professional, not on them because they've requested it. If that little bit of cupping, little bit of light massage or whatever it might be is detrimental, if it's contraindicated, it's not right for them, just because they've asked for it doesn't make it okay to provide it. So you need to decide if you know that's actually not right for them. You need to, again, this is all about communication. You need to explain to them why, no, that's actually not ideal. This is why we're not going to do it today. This is why you need to go and see somebody else. If you have referred somebody on to a different health professional, it can be worth following up with them. They might then come back to you for further treatment for something else down the track, so you're maintaining that relationship with them. Also, it's good to just sometimes check in just to make sure, particularly if you think it's potentially a serious health condition where they need to see a medical practitioner, sometimes it's good just to check in to make sure they did actually go off and see someone, just to be sure you put your concerns at ease, that they have looked after themselves, they have gone where you recommended, and that they are okay. So as I mentioned already, you'll be held accountable for any treatment you provide, regardless of what the patient wishes. So make sure you know it's clinically justified, and if you think it's not, that's when you need to make sure you're having that conversation and just explain to them why this particular treatment they've come to you for isn't appropriate in this particular circumstance. Explain why it could actually be detrimental to them. Anytime you don't provide some sort of treatment or therapy for your patients, you should be recording that as well in the clinical record. The record isn't just for what you've done, the record is also sometimes for what you haven't done. So if patients come in requesting a particular type of therapy, but you've said no for this reason, this is not ideal, noting that down gives you that full history of how you've treated and not treated the patient. So if there are questions down the track, you've got that history of when you didn't treat and why, and that shows that decision making there for you. Tip number 5, moving into informed consent. This is a really big communication piece of being a healthcare professional. It's also a really big area, I guess, for us at Guild Insurance, because we get a little bit frustrated with informed consent. We know you need to be doing informed consent. However, and I say this broadly, not just for people within your profession, but I'm talking all healthcare professionals out there, generally it's not done as well as it should be done. And it does impact patients' likelihood to complain, and it does sometimes then make it challenging for us as an insurer who's there to defend you. If you haven't gone through informed consent appropriately and the patient hasn't been able to give their informed consent, that can impact the outcomes of claims. So I'm going to give you a case example here. This is a fairly common one we're seeing at the moment, where a patient suffered a pneumothorax following dry needling. Patient was a self-employed tradesperson and was unable to work for a period of time because of that injury. The patient engaged a solicitor to seek some financial compensation, and the patient alleged that had the risk of a pneumothorax been known, they wouldn't have consented to that treatment. So a really common complaint we see in informed consent is the patient saying, had I known that could have happened, I wouldn't have agreed to treatment. Now, quite often we could question that. Really, would they have really not gone through with the treatment? Most patients know that when we agree to treatment, we are taking on some risk. There's always some risk in any form of treatment. So a lot of patients will accept the risk of a pneumothorax, understanding the fact that as a health professional, you'll be reducing the likelihood of doing what you can do to minimise the likelihood of that happening, but they will accept some risk. However, if the patient hasn't had the risk explained to them, they haven't had the opportunity to accept that risk themselves, therefore they haven't given their informed consent. And whilst we might doubt if they would have actually said no to the treatment, we can't prove that because they weren't given that opportunity to consent or decline their consent without that information because they didn't get that information. So again, this is a really huge part of communication that too often isn't done particularly well. So I'm going to go on to explaining a little bit more about what consent is and what needs to happen. So for those of you who are AHPRA registered, this statement I've got on the screen here, this is taken from the AHPRA Code of Conduct. This definition of informed consent, though, is really across all areas of healthcare. So for those who aren't AHPRA registered, this is just the standard definition of what informed consent is. So informed consent is a person's voluntary decision about healthcare made with knowledge and understanding of benefits and risks involved. The key parts is that knowledge and understanding. If they don't have the knowledge and understanding of benefits and risks, they're not informed. Without that, they can give a consent, but it's not informed consent, and informed consent is a standard that is expected now. So to make sure your patients are giving informed consent, a few things you need to think about. This has to be a conversation, so again, it's communication, has to be a conversation between you as a treating practitioner and them as the patient. This has to be a conversation that you have with them. You can't delegate that to somebody else. You can't just have information on your website, for example. You have to have the conversation with them. Make sure you're using language they will understand. If there's a risk of a pneumothorax, you should probably tell them what that is, because most patients probably won't know. Depending on what other sort of therapy and treatment you provide, make sure you're using terminology that a patient who doesn't have clinical knowledge will understand. Encourage your patients to ask questions, and when you do that, make sure there's actually some stops in the conversation where they can actually get into the conversation. If you just tell them you can ask questions, but you keep talking really fast like this and you explain things, then off you go and suddenly you're doing treatment, they may feel like they haven't actually had a chance to ask a question. Some patients will interrupt you, some won't. So just when we say give them a chance to ask questions, really be genuine and think about how you do that and how you make that happen. Informed consent should include informed financial consent. Now, how much this plays into the sort of the conversations you have will really depend on the sort of treatment you have. For some areas of healthcare, informed consent, treatment can be quite expensive. Some, you might have some set fees, and so the informed consent around financial aspects may not change throughout treatment, but sometimes it does. So an example where this really comes into play is someone like a dentist, where treatment becomes expensive, and sometimes as they're going along through treatment, it changes and becomes much more expensive. So this is really significant for them. It may not be as much for you, but you do just need to make sure your patients are very clear about the cost of whatever sort of treatment or therapy you're providing, so they're not surprised at the end when they get a bill. Signed consent forms are a really popular thing in healthcare, and I think sometimes there's a little bit of a thinking that if we just have a patient sign a form, then that's all good, and then they've consented and they understand. If you do use a signed consent form for any treatment that you provide, you need to make sure you're having a conversation with the patient about the risk, and you can talk through the form together, but you can't just give them the form and have them sign it without explaining the form. So that's why I like to say that the form supports the conversation, but it can't replace it. We have had cases of guild insurance where people have said, but I didn't consent to that. The health professional says, but here's the signed form. The patient says, but I didn't understand the form. It's not informed consent. So yes, you can use informed consent forms. You can also use brochures. You might use diagrams, models, depending on what it is you're doing. That supports the conversation, but you still have to explain it. So this is a really important conversation to have, so your patients are fully informed, fully aware. When they give their informed consent to treatment, they need to understand what they're consenting to. But remember, this is all about also giving them the option to say, actually, no, I don't want to go down that path. I'm not happy with that treatment. I'm not happy with those potential risks. Is there another way I can be treated? So it's not just about you giving them information and off you go. It's giving them a choice to consent or decline their consent and discuss other treatment options. Really important you think about how you're doing this, because as I said, it's too often not done as well as it should. The other area that bothers us, last point there before I move on to the next area. Make a record of the conversation in the clinical record. So if the patient says, I didn't consent, and you say, yes, you did, we did have a conversation, this is what I explained, we want a record in the clinical record of what it was you discussed with them. That's where sometimes having a form for them to sign can help, because you can use that as the record, but you don't have to have the signed form. You can also just write into the clinical record that this is what was discussed with the patient, here were the risks that were discussed, questions the patient asked, patient has agreed. There must be a record so we know you've had that conversation. Speaking of clinical records and speaking of things unfortunately not done too well, this is our other little bugbear at Guild Insurance. Too often records are kept, but they're not kept to the standard that's needed and required. I think that one of the challenges with this is that, well, there's a few challenges. I know it's hard to keep detailed clinical records. They take a long time to write. They take up a lot of your time, sort of administrative time in between seeing patients. I understand that frustration. But I think one of the challenges I get the feeling I see is when we talk to health professionals about this is maybe not fully understanding sometimes, I guess, the reason and the benefit of having records. I think too often people think records are there because if a patient complains, you've got the history of what happened to defend yourself. That's one reason, but there's more than that. So there's 4 key reasons that I'm going to talk through now. One is about the continuity of safe care. So again, from the Code of Conduct, maintaining clear and accurate health records is essential for continuing good care of patients. For you to know how you've treated your patient in the past, how they presented, why they presented, the conversations you've had, how it is they're feeling after treatment, all of that sort of information you cannot remember. I know sometimes you think you'll remember bits, and you probably do remember some things about your patients, but you cannot rely on your memory. I've seen too many cases where it doesn't work. For you to continue to provide appropriate care for that particular patient and their condition, you need to have a history of how they presented in the past, what sort of treatment and therapy you provided, how they responded. For you to continue that care over time, you need the history of what it is you've done. You can't rely on them to remember, and you can't rely on yourself to remember. You need that history of what's happened. You also need to know that it is just a professional obligation. So again, for those AHPRA registered, in the Code of Conduct, there is information about the requirement for record keeping. You've also got then the standard there from your association in terms of what they expect. It is just a standard requirement for all health professionals in this country, regardless of whether you're regulated by AHPRA or other self-governing bodies. You do need to keep good clinical records. If a matter was to go to some investigator, even if maybe a lawyer gets involved, they will need to see good records. So it is a professional obligation that you all need to adhere to. So that comes into the area of defending you if there's an allegation against you. So if a patient does complain that they were harmed, they weren't happy with treatment, and you come to us as your insurer, we need to see good records. So a little bit of a saying that we have in the insurance world is that good records is good defence, poor records is poor defence, and no records is no defence. Now that doesn't mean we wouldn't defend you if there were terrible records. It just makes it so much harder for us to do that. If we can't clearly see and prove to others why you did what you did, it's really, it's really hard to prove you did the right thing. So we need those records to show you've done what you should have done as a health professional. And the fourth area is funding. So if you have any involvement, if your patients have any involvement from funding bodies, could be private health insurers, potentially Medicare, there's a range of different health funding bodies out there. These bodies can and do conduct audits. They want to be sure that the funds they're providing and the rebates they're providing to patients are appropriate. They can conduct audits where they will ask to see patient records. They'll want to make sure that that funding and that rebate the patient received was clinically justified. If they can't see how the patient was treated and why, they can demand money be repaid. If you ever have to repay money to any funding provider, we as an insurance company, and this is the same for all insurance companies, we as an insurance company will provide support to you and defend you and help you out through that investigation process. But the outcome of repaying money is not covered by insurance, because that's on you to be doing the right thing. We don't cover those sorts of fines and expectations of repayments. That is on you. So it's often quite a financial burden for people in those situations when that happens. So make sure your records can clearly show what you did and why, and provide that clinical justification for what it is you've done. I'm going to now give you 2 case examples of clinical records where showing, I guess, how in different ways poor records can impact you. I think it's very easy to think, again, it's just there for, if someone makes a complaint, but showing what poor records actually, the problems they can cause. So in this first example, a patient complained that Chinese herbal medicine products they were given were of no benefit and actually made them feel unwell. So they made them feel worse. They complained that the herbs that were selected for them shouldn't have been selected for them, and they complained that the practitioner didn't consider their numerous health conditions that they had advised the practitioner of. So we do see cases where information that's been given to the health professional hasn't been applied in their clinical decision making. This is sometimes because it hasn't been put into the clinical record, so the patient may come in with information, they may fill in a new patient form depending how your practice is set up. If that information doesn't make it into the clinical record, it doesn't guide your clinical decision making. But also what we know sometimes happens is the information gets put into the record, but if you don't actually then refer back to it when you're making decisions for that patient, it's not going to guide your thinking, and that's potentially when you're going to be making some errors and making decisions for that patient that will be detrimental. So make sure you're using the records. Again, we talked about that continuity of care. Make sure you're using information in the record that you've got about your patient to guide that clinical decision making, so you're making the most appropriate decision for that patient and not making decisions that could actually cause harm to them. The other example I want to give you, one we're seeing quite a bit at the moment. AHPRA investigated an allegation that there was blisters and cause and there was negligent treatment from cupping. When they investigated, they said there was actually no harm caused. They think that the treatment that was provided was clinically appropriate and there was no negligent finding and no adverse finding against the practitioner from a treatment perspective. However, they weren't happy with the level of the standard of the records, and they expected that practitioner to undergo some training in record keeping. We're seeing this quite a bit with AHPRA and the various boards that sit under AHPRA, that even if they think the clinical care that was provided was fair and appropriate and didn't actually cause harm to the patient, if they still don't think the records are up to scratch, that can be their finding. And they will require a practitioner to undergo training. It can often be quite a few hours that practitioner needs to source themselves and pay themselves. So I think AHPRA and the various boards are getting really quite, I guess, a little bit frustrated that the level of records we see is often quite poor. They've put out a lot of information available. Again, even for those of you who aren't AHPRA registered, I recommend going onto the AHPRA website. There's a lot of information about good record keeping, and there's also some checklists and tools on there for you to help, I guess, check and assess your record keeping to see how good it is. So use the resources that are there to help you really assess your record keeping. Is it up to the standard that's required? Do you need to lift that standard? Because if there was an investigation, how's that going to impact the investigation, the claim? So it's not just about that defence and showing that you've done the right thing. There can be other implications for you, as you can see from these two examples. Moving on to tip number 7, regulatory requirements. Now, a lot of these that I'm showing you now are, again, AHPRA registered. I know some of you will be, some won't be, but also you've got the Code of Professional Ethics there from your association as well. This is just to remind you there is a lot expected of you as health professionals in this country. These are a lot of documents that I bet for those of you who are AHPRA registered possibly haven't read them all. Did you know this top on the left is about criminal history? There is an expectation for those who are AHPRA registered, there is an expectation, you should see this when you renew your registration each year with AHPRA, it'll ask you about criminal history and you need to declare, I think that's when it is asked. There is it's a registration standard. Their standard is, and you'll need to read this because I don't know the exact wording, but if you are charged with an offence that has a particular level of potential punishment, so you may not be convicted, but you've just been charged, you need to let AHPRA know. A lot of people don't know this, and where this gets challenging is that standard is across all states, but because states have different laws, what sorts of crimes can fit under that can differ. I was recently informed of a dentist in Tasmania who had some sort of speeding offence, a driving offence. It was probably more than speeding. There's potentially maybe drug and alcohol involved. I'm not exactly sure. But the driving offence actually fit. He was charged with a driving offence and it actually fit into that standard. He didn't think it would meet that level and he didn't notify, and then he was in trouble for that one. So that's just an example. My recommendation from a criminal perspective, if you are ever charged with anything and you're registered with AHPRA, please check that standard to see if you need to let them know. Another one, I won't go through all of these. This is really just an example to remind you there is a lot expected of you in terms of your professional conduct and behaviour. You need to be aware of them. But the other one I did just want to make mention of is the professional indemnity standard. So again, if you're AHPRA registered, there is an expectation that you have professional indemnity insurance. It is a requirement. You cannot practice without it. We are seeing a little bit of a trend at the moment, not quite sure why, where practitioners are forgetting to renew their professional indemnity insurance and then therefore practicing uninsured, which is not allowed under AHPRA. Where that becomes potentially, even more so of a problem, is when you renew your registration each year. As a registration standard, one of the tick boxes is where you say, yes, I've got my professional indemnity insurance. We've seen practitioners pinged twice because, one, they're practicing without insurance. 2, they've told their regulator they do have insurance and they don't, so you've made a false declaration to AHPRA, which is, they come down pretty hard on that one too. So please make sure you understand, for those AHPRA registered, it's even more pressing, I guess, what it is you need to adhere to. You need to understand the regulations that govern and control what you do. You need to make sure you're adhering. You need to be reading these documents. But also for all of you, the Code of Professional Ethics in the corner, please make sure you understand that and understand what's expected of you. I know it's the sort of boring part of being a health professional. You don't want to be reading policies, guidelines and documents and all that sort of stuff, but it is incredibly important. Number 8, clothing. Now, this was a bit of an interesting area when I was putting this presentation together and thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about. We see, for a lot of health professionals that undertake sort of manual therapy and those sorts of treatments where you need clothing removed, such as massage, dry needling, cupping, we see quite a lot of complaints in the way the handling of asking patients to remove clothing or adjust clothing is done quite poorly. I have to say, very pleasingly, I haven't actually seen any claims for your professions. So I'm very impressed. I see this a lot for osteopaths, physiotherapists. Just because we haven't seen them, I thought it was still worth mentioning because I think there's potential for this to occur in your areas. Also, particularly because we are seeing patients become, as I said, more willing to complain, I think this is something worth considering what could happen. Just because we haven't seen a complaint doesn't mean patients haven't felt this level of discomfort and haven't been unhappy. So this is for those of you who do any sort of therapy treatment where patients are adjusting clothing. Something to think about. As I said, fortunately haven't seen the claims, but I wouldn't say it wouldn't happen based on what we're seeing with other professions and based on what we're hearing from patients. So an example, patients submitted a notification to AHPRA claiming they felt their cupping therapy practitioner behaved inappropriately and made them feel uncomfortable. They hadn't received cupping therapy before, the patient was unaware of the need to remove and adjust clothing, and the reason for doing that wasn't explained to them. So again, this is a little bit about those expectations, and this is all about conversation. It might seem obvious to someone doing cupping that you're going to need to get to their whole back, they're going to need to remove some clothes. What's obvious to you will not be obvious to them. And if things aren't explained really clearly about why clothing needs to be moved or adjusted, patients will often feel uncomfortable. What we often hear patients complain about is they were just told, look, can you just remove your top? But they're not told clearly why. So what I'm going to be doing now is going through some tips, what we expect when you're dealing with clothing for those who work in any of those sort of spaces, massage and those sorts of areas where this might become something you need to think about. Do not make assumptions about what patients will understand about clothing getting in the way of treatment. So again, it might seem obvious to you if you're doing dry needling and maybe parts of the back, that clothing might get in the way, won't always be obvious to patients. So don't make assumptions about what they will know and what they will understand. Don't make assumptions also about a patient's comfort level. We do hear people say, oh, you know, if the patient was the same gender as me, same age, I thought they'd be sort of a bit more comfortable. I've heard a practitioner say, but I'm only sort of mindful of this conversation when I've had Muslim women come in. It's like, this is not just something for Muslim women, this is all patients. So don't make assumptions about who the patient is based on what you can see, based on their age, their gender, their religion. Do not make assumptions about how comfortable they will feel with moving and adjusting clothing. Explain to the patients what you would like them to remove or to adjust. Ask them if they're okay with this. Ask them if they're okay to do it. Do not tell them to do it. Give them the option to decline. Again, this is about informed consent. If they don't want to move clothing and that means you need to change how you treat them, then you just need to explain that to them. They don't have to consent to removing their clothing. That might mean the treatment they came in looking for can't be done or has to be done differently. You need to explain that, but don't just tell them to remove their clothes. Explain to them why the clothes are in the way and why you need them to be, why they will prevent that sort of treatment, and discuss the options. Give them towels or gowns to cover themselves. So if they're on a treatment bed, say they're getting a massage, covering them with a gown or covering them with a towel, the parts of their body that you don't need to you're not actually touching at that time, cover them up so they've got that modesty, they're not feeling so exposed. It's a comment we hear a lot from patients, that they felt really exposed. They didn't need to be lying there just in their underpants when it was just their shoulders being treated, could have had a towel across their lower body. Make sure the towels and gowns you offer are of a suitable size to cover them. We often hear patients say, yeah, the towel was really small though, it didn't cover me. Give them things that are easily going to cover them, particularly think with massage, if they're going to be rolling over, you need to be able to adjust it. You don't want things falling off as they move on the treatment table. You should be leaving the room when your patients are changing, undressing, redressing. So explain to them, if they've agreed, what you would like them to take off, what you would like them to leave on. Leave the room while they do that. Don't just say remove your top. Women won't know if that means their bra as well. Remove your pants. Is that just trousers? Is that underpants? Be very clear. If you could take this off, leave that on. Here's a towel to cover yourself. Here's a gown. I'll leave the room and get comfortable. Very, very clear, very specific. Again, communication. Ask the patient for consent if you need to adjust during treatment. Sometimes you've already started treatment. I see things like maybe just wanting to lower the trousers if they've got fairly high-waisted trousers, or you might just want to lift the t-shirt a little bit or something like that. Don't just move a patient's clothing Even if they're already partially undressed and they've consented, do not adjust their clothing without asking them. They will often feel very uncomfortable, even if even if they've consented to some level of clothes being adjusted. Don't just keep going and adjust or unclip or unhook or move things. Ask them before you do it. And again, they can decline. This isn't just about telling them. This is them giving their consent, and they can say no, and then you just need to explain how that changes. I think that's the last one I've got there. Does this make sense to you all? As I said, it's an interesting area for me to bring up with you because I haven't seen claims, but based on what I see with other professions, it wouldn't surprise me if we do start seeing these. So I think it's very important for you all to be thinking about. It is something that patients are becoming more likely to complain about, even if the treatment provider was great and they were happy with that. If they've been made to feel uncomfortable, they are complaining. Oh no, there was one more, sorry. Your process, as I mentioned already, process need to apply to all patients, all genders, all ages. It doesn't matter who they are. Just because you've got to know a patient pretty well, just because they're the same age or same gender as you, don't make assumptions. Same process all the time. The benefit of doing that too is, we talked earlier about falling into routines and habits. So sometimes you go out of the room, sometimes you don't. Not sure, do I need to for this patient? Then you might get it wrong. Don't think about what you need to do for what patient, just have the same process. Here's what you need to remove, here's what leave on, here's a towel, here's a gown, I'm going to leave the room for every single patient. Moving on to advertising. This is again for those who are AHPRA registered. However, I would recommend for those who aren't AHPRA registered to consider this because it is, I guess, what some would consider sort of best practice from an advertising perspective. So a couple of things to keep in mind. This is a standard on advertising that you need to be adhering to. What you need to understand is this is national law. This is written into the law for all of the 15 professions registered under AHPRA. If you don't adhere, if you breach the advertising guidelines, it's a breach of the law. The reason this is in place is this is all about patients understanding information so they can make the most appropriate decision for them in terms of their healthcare. So these two quotes have been taken from that guidelines document. The reason AHPRA really cracks down on advertising is they want to make sure patients are getting the most appropriate information for them, for their clinical situation, so they can make decisions about what is appropriate for them. There's a lot of information there on advertising. I'm just going to quickly go through a few tips for you. Things to not do. You need to make sure your information is not false, misleading or deceptive. This is a line taken straight from that guidelines document. So be very clear, open, don't use vague information. Be very clear about what it is you can do in your work, what service you provide, and what they're going to get from that. You cannot use testimonials or any reviews in your advertising, according to AHPRA. A testimonial is any positive review about the clinical care you provide. If you are AHPRA registered, please do not have this on your website. I know it's probably one of the most common breaches we see. That also means that if you see positive comments about you on somewhere like Google Reviews, you can't link through that onto your website either. That's the same thing. There was talk a couple of years ago about this being, the law changing, this being allowed. That didn't go through. You still cannot have testimonials in your advertising. You cannot use the term specialised, specialist, special interest, all those sorts of words, unless you hold specialist registration, and none of you would. There's only a couple of professions under AHPRA that hold specialist registration. Their thinking is that if you use those terms, patients will think they're going to see a specialist and not someone with a generalist registration. So that is what AHPRA expects of you with those words. You need to be really clear about the information. Don't make promises you can't keep. Healthcare is never guaranteed in terms of the outcomes. You can't promise you will cure a patient. You can't promise when they will feel better. So you need to be very clear that you're not giving them expectations that you may not be able to meet. They need to be very clear on what is realistic for them. You need to make sure you're advertising in a way that does acknowledge there is risk. So you don't want to make it sound foolproof. Words like safe and effective, AHPRA don't really like, because we're not saying treatment is unsafe, but when you say it's safe, that could be suggesting that it's always okay and that no one will ever suffer any harm. But we know that does happen with medical treatment, any sort of clinical treatment. Don't make comparisons to other people who do your work. See lots of people saying, best physiotherapist in Melbourne. You can't prove those sorts of things, so avoid any of that kind of stuff where you're making comparisons that you can't back up. There's no data on those. The last one, if you're using any third party to help you with your advertising, and a lot of small businesses do, you may not be experts on building websites, that's okay, but they need to understand your requirements from an advertising perspective, and you need to make sure you're checking things and approving things. It's not okay to turn around to ARPA saying, oh, but I didn't build the website. That doesn't matter, you're responsible for it, so check anything someone else does for you. The link down the bottom there is for this advertising hub here. ARPA is providing now a lot more information online to help people with their advertising. I think they know years ago they put out a guidelines document and just said kind of go for it, and it was very complicating for a lot of people. Their guidelines document now has a lot more information, and this advertising hub has examples and lots of tips and tricks to make sure your advertising complies. So please do check this. It's one we're seeing a lot of people still go wrong with. And my last tip for you today, don't think it won't happen to you. I think it's very easy to think things won't go bad for you, but as an insurance company, we know sometimes they do. My reason for leaving you with this is not for you to walk out of here scared your patients are going to complain and sue you. It's about having a balance in your thinking. It's about acknowledging that as a healthcare professional, you should be doing all you can do to mitigate your risk and lower the risk, trying to do all you can to ensure things don't go wrong, but also acknowledging, unfortunately, in healthcare, in life, sometimes things don't go as planned and sometimes things do go wrong. When you think things will never go wrong, you're less likely to put the right risk mitigation in place, more likely for things to go wrong. So it's about acknowledging there is risk in what you do what you can do to reduce the likelihood of those things happening, then make sure you should all have that insurance, hopefully with us. If not, feel free to come and have a chat, but regardless of who you're insured with, if things do go wrong, make sure you reach out and seek that support and advice. That's what your insurance companies are there to do if things do go a bit pear-shaped. That's just a summary of the tips. As I said, here's my contact details, so if you do have questions you think of after today about insurance or risk, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me. If you've got any questions about your insurance, risk management, please feel free to come by and have a chat with us. That's everything. Thank you.